The first parcel had arrived 5 years ago. It was a small, plain box wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple twine, laid upon a silver salver and presented to him by a footman whose face was a mask of polite indifference. There was no sender's mark, no return address, only the name of his estate, Blackwood Manor, and his own title, stark and impersonal. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, had stared at it, a cold knot tightening in his gut. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried moss, was a single, perfectly carved wooden wren, its head cocked as if listening for a song that would never come. It was a cruelty, a reminder. Genevieve had loved the wrens that nested in the ivy beneath her window. She had been gone for nearly a year by then, vanished into the shame and scandal that his cousin, Marcus Thorne, had so carefully exposed. The official story was one of betrayal, of a flighty duchess who had planned to elope with a lover, her heart as empty as the jewel boxes she had supposedly looted. Alistair had believed it. His pride, a fortress he had mistaken for strength, had demanded he believe it. He had burned her supposed letters without a second thought. The sight of her familiar script twisted into confessions of infidelity, a poison he could not bear to look at for long. The second year, the parcel contained a single wildflower, pressed between sheets of waxed paper, a sea lavender. He remembered a holiday they had taken before the rot set in, walking along a windswept cliff, the air thick with the scent of salt and the purple flowers that clung to the chalky earth. He had tucked one into her hair. The third year, a small, knitted mitten, impossibly soft, in a shade of blue that mirrored the winter sky. The fourth, a small watercolor, amateurish but evocative, of a churning gray sea beneath a bruised-looking sky. Each one was a ghost, a whisper from a life he had methodically destroyed. Marcus had always dismissed them. "A morbid prank, Alistair," he would say, his voice laced with the perfect measure of concern. "Some wretched soul twisting the knife. You must not let it torment you. She made her choice." But now, on the 5th Christmas Eve since his world had been hollowed out, Alistair knew he could no longer afford the luxury of his cousin's certainty. The silence in Blackwood Manor was no longer a sign of peace, but of profound absence. It was a living thing, a cold presence that coiled in the vast, empty rooms and mocked the festive holly and ivy draped over portraits of his ancestors. He was 35 years old, a duke with lands that stretched across 3 counties, and he was utterly, miserably alone. The life Marcus had helped him preserve was a gilded cage, and its bars were forged from his own foolish pride. This year's parcel sat on the polished mahogany of his desk. It was identical to the others. He had watched the local carrier hand it to his butler, his heart hammering against his ribs with a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. For 5 years he had been a passive recipient of these spectral messages. He had allowed himself to be haunted. No more. He had a plan, a fast horse, saddled and waiting in the stables, a loyal groom, a man who had served his father and knew how to keep his mouth shut. He had told Marcus he was going for a long ride, to clear his head before the suffocating formality of Christmas dinner with the requisite distant relatives. Marcus had patted his shoulder, his eyes full of that damnable, sympathetic pity that now felt like a shroud. Alistair picked up the parcel. He did not open it. Not yet. He walked through the silent house, the tapestries absorbing the sound of his boots. He passed the grand ballroom where he had last danced with Genevieve, the memory a shard of glass in his mind. He remembered the feel of her in his arms, the scent of her perfume, the way she had looked at him with a trust he had so casually betrayed. The accusation he had hurled at her that final night echoed in the cavernous space of his memory. Cold, vile, irrevocable. He had called her a liar and a thief, his voice a weapon meant to wound, and it had. He had seen the light in her eyes extinguish, replaced by a calm, terrifying emptiness. She had not cried. She had not screamed. She had simply looked through him, as if he were no longer there. That night, she had vanished. She had left her wedding ring on the mantelpiece in their bedroom, a perfect circle of gold and diamonds, cold as a star. She had taken nothing else. No jewels, no money, no clothes beyond what she wore. It was the detail that had begun to unravel Marcus's story. A thief would have taken the jewels. A woman running to a lover would have packed her finest gowns. Genevieve had simply walked away, shedding the title and the husband who had condemned her, without a trial. Alistair reached the stables. The air was frigid, stinging his lungs. His groom, old Silas, nodded once, his weathered face impassive. Alistair mounted, the leather creaking in the frozen silence. He tucked the unopened parcel into his saddlebag. "We follow the carrier, Silas," Alistair said, his voice low and tight. "He has a 90-mile route. We stay out of sight, but we do not lose him." Silas did not ask why. He simply mounted his own horse and fell in behind his duke. They rode out of the grand gates of Blackwood, leaving the hollow spectacle of Christmas behind them. The journey began. 90 miles of frozen roads and skeletal trees, the sky a sheet of pewter above them. With every mile, Alistair felt as though he were traveling not across the country, but back through time, back toward the woman he had wronged, each hoofbeat a penance, each cold breath a prayer for a truth he was terrified to find. Genevieve, who now called herself Jenna, wiped a dusting of flour from her cheek with the back of her hand. The small cottage was filled with the warm, comforting scent of baking bread. Outside, a fierce wind howled in from the sea, rattling the single window pane and testing the integrity of the roof she had patched herself last autumn. It was a meager existence, a world away from the silken draperies and soft carpets of Blackwood, but it was hers, and more importantly, it was Thomas's. Her son, her beautiful, solemn little boy, sat at the small wooden table, carefully drawing a ship on a piece of scrap paper with a nub of charcoal. He was 4 years old, soon to be 5. He had her dark hair, but his eyes were his father's, a clear, startling gray, like a winter storm. They were a constant, aching reminder. Every time he looked at her, she saw the ghost of the man she had once loved, the man who had shattered her heart with such brutal efficiency. 5 years. It felt like a lifetime. She had arrived in the coastal village of Saltwind with nothing but a few coins, a fierce will to survive, and a secret life growing inside her. She had found work as a seamstress, her fine needlework a skill that translated from embroidering ducal crests to mending fishermen's nets. She had taken a room at the inn, then this small, damp cottage at the edge of the village. The people of Saltwind were rough, but kind. They asked few questions. A young widow, they assumed, seeking anonymity. She did not correct them. The annual parcel was her one concession to the past, her one tether. It was a foolish, dangerous ritual, but she could not stop. It was not a plea for rescue, nor an act of forgiveness. It was a statement of existence. I am alive. I survived you. This year she had sent a small, polished piece of driftwood, its shape worn smooth by the relentless sea, resembling a sleeping seabird. It felt fitting. She, too, had been battered and worn, but she had endured. She had addressed it as always, in a disguised, blocky script, and given it to the weekly carrier with a few extra coins for his trouble. He knew not to ask. Thomas looked up from his drawing. "Mama, will Father Christmas come on a ship?" Genevieve's heart clenched. She knelt beside him, smoothing his dark hair. "Perhaps he will, my love, for boys who live by the sea." She had told him his father was a sailor, lost in a storm long ago. It was a kinder lie than the truth. The truth was that his father was a duke who lived in a palace of cold stone, a man who had believed a lie because it was easier than believing in her. What would Thomas do with a truth like that? A truth that would tell him he was the son of a man who had cast his mother aside like a broken toy. A sudden, sharp rap on the door made them both jump. It was too late for a neighbor. The wind was too vicious for casual callers. She felt a prickle of unease. Wiping her hands on her apron, she moved to the door, her body instinctively shielding Thomas's small form from view. She lifted the latch and opened the door a crack. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from her grasp. A man stood on her doorstep, tall and broad, his greatcoat dusted with snow. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but there was something in his stance, a familiar stillness that made the air freeze in her lungs. He removed his hat. Alistair. The world tilted on its axis. He was older. There were lines of strain around his eyes, a harshness in the set of his jaw that had not been there before. But it was him. The sight of him was not a shock, so much as a collision, a violent impact that knocked all the breath from her body. The carefully constructed walls of her new life crumbled to dust in an instant. "Genevieve," he said. His voice was raw, broken. She found her own voice and was surprised by the ice in it. "My name is Jenna. You're mistaken, sir." She tried to close the door, but his hand shot out, not to force it open, but to hold it steady. His fingers were bare, red with cold. "Please, do not." It was the plea in his voice that undid her more than any command would have. Behind her, Thomas peeked around her skirts, his gray eyes wide with curiosity. Alistair's gaze dropped. He saw the boy. He saw the eyes. Genevieve watched the entire sequence of his thoughts play out on his face. Shock, disbelief, a dawning, horrifying comprehension, and then a look of such profound devastation that it almost broke through her armor. He did not need to ask. The boy's age, the unmistakable Beaumont eyes. The truth was there, a living, breathing accusation between them. "He is..." Alistair's voice failed him. "He is my son," she said, her tone sharp and protective. She pulled Thomas behind her again. "You have no business here, Your Grace. This is a respectable village. We have no place for dukes." The formal title was a slap, and she saw him flinch. Good. She wanted him to feel a fraction of the pain she had lived with for 5 years. The humiliation, the fear, the bone, deep loneliness. "I followed the carrier," he said, as if that explained everything. He reached into his coat and pulled out the small, unopened parcel. Her parcel. He held it out to her. 5 years, every Christmas. Why? "To remind you that not all ghosts are content to stay buried," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Now, please, leave." "I cannot," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the sliver of space where he knew Thomas was hiding. "Now I cannot." The wind howled, throwing a spray of icy rain against the cottage. Thomas sneezed, a small, fragile sound. The sound seemed to break a spell. Genevieve looked at her shivering son, then at the powerful, broken man standing in the encroaching storm. Her heart, a thing she had thought frozen solid, twisted with a painful, unwelcome lurch of something that felt dangerously like pity. "Get inside before you freeze," she snapped, pulling the door open wider. "But know this, Alistair. You are welcome to the fire, but you are not welcome here." He stepped over the threshold, bringing the cold and the storm and the whole of their ruined past into her small, safe world. Alistair felt as though he were walking on shattered glass. The cottage was tiny, just 2 rooms, but it was filled with a warmth that Blackwood had not known in years. A fire crackled in the hearth. A half-finished loaf of bread sat on the counter, and in the center of it all was the boy, his son. The child, Thomas, stared at him with an unnerving, solemn intensity. Alistair's own eyes looked back at him from a small, innocent face. He felt a wave of nausea. He had a son, a 4-year-old son, a child who had spent his entire life in this humble cottage, while his father rattled around a cold, empty mausoleum 90 miles away, drowning in self-pity. Genevieve, Jenna she called herself, moved with a tense, guarded grace. She poured Thomas a cup of milk and settled him back at the table with his charcoal, her movements forming a protective barrier around him. She did not offer Alistair a seat. She did not offer him anything. She stood by the hearth, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. She was different. The soft, pliable young woman he had married was gone. In her place was this stranger with hard hands and weary eyes. She was thinner, but there was a strength in her, a resilience forged in hardship that he found both terrifying and magnificent. He had done this to her. He had taken the Duchess of Blackwood and stripped her down to this essential, unbreakable core. "What do you want, Alistair?" she asked, her voice flat. He had rehearsed 100 speeches on the long ride, 1,000 apologies. Now they all felt like ash in his mouth. What could he possibly say? "I am sorry I destroyed your life because my pride was more important than my faith in you." "The truth," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I am beginning to see I was a fool. I was manipulated. By Marcus." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her. "Marcus? Of course. Your cousin was always so very helpful. Did he help you believe I was an adulteress? A thief? Or did your own arrogance manage that on its own?" Her words were stones, and they hit their mark. "Both," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "My pride was a weapon he knew how to aim. He showed me letters. He had a witness. I was blind." "You were a judge and a jury and an executioner," she corrected him, her voice dangerously quiet. "You did not ask me. You did not look at me and see the woman you had married. You looked at me and saw a stain on your family's honor. You were disgusted. I saw it in your eyes." He could not deny it. He remembered the revulsion, the cold fury that had eclipsed every tender feeling he'd ever had for her. "I was," he said, "and it is a shame I will carry for the rest of my life. Genevieve, Do not call me that," she cut in sharply. "That woman is gone. You killed her." The finality in her voice was like a door slamming shut. He looked at his son, who was now watching them, his charcoal forgotten. The boy's gaze was not fearful, merely curious. He was seeing his mother, strong and defiant, and a strange man who made the very air in the cottage crackle with tension. "What is his name?" Alistair asked, his throat tight. "Thomas," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly as she looked at her son. "Thomas," Alistair repeated. It was his own father's name. A fresh wave of shame washed over him. She had given their son his grandfather's name, a link to a heritage he had been denied. He knew he could not fix this in one night. He could not erase 5 years of pain with a few words. He had to show her. He had to prove that he was not the same man who had sent her into the cold. "I am not leaving Saltwind," he stated, not as a demand, but as a fact. "I will not force my way into your life, but I will not abandon my son. Or you. Not again." She stared at him, her eyes searching his face for the lies, the manipulation she expected. "There is nothing for you here, Your Grace. No finery, no servants. The inn has fleas and the food is passable at best." "I am aware," he said. "I will manage." He took a step toward the door, his movements stiff. He paused, his hand on the latch. "He deserves to know his father. And you deserve to have your name cleared. I will destroy Marcus. I will undo every lie he told. I swear it." He did not wait for her reply. He opened the door and stepped back out into the storm, the icy wind a welcome punishment. He found Silas waiting patiently with the horses, huddled in the meager shelter of a neighboring boat shed. "We are staying at the inn, Silas," Alistair said, his voice grim. "Indefinitely." Silas nodded, his expression giving nothing away, though Alistair knew the old man's mind was racing. "Very good, Your Grace." As they led the horses through the muddy, unlit lanes of Saltwind, Alistair felt the monumental scale of the task ahead of him. He had not just lost his wife, he had thrown her away. He had not just been ignorant of his son's existence, he was the reason for his exile. Atonement was not a matter of apology. It was a matter of action. He had to tear down the world built on Marcus's lies, and he had to do it from a flea-bitten room in a fishing village 90 miles from the seat of his power. It was a fitting penance, and it was just the beginning. The Duke's presence in Saltwind was as subtle as a thunderclap. Within a day, the entire village knew that the grand gentleman who had taken the best room at the Salty Dog was the Duke of Blackwood, and that he had come for Jenna, the quiet seamstress in the cottage by the shore. Whispers followed Genevieve like her own shadow whenever she ventured out for supplies. She felt their curious, pitying stares. She, who had guarded her anonymity so fiercely, was now the center of a drama she wanted no part in. Alistair, to his credit, kept his word. He did not come to her cottage again. He did not try to force a confrontation. But he was there, a constant, looming presence. She would see him walking on the beach in the early morning, staring out at the gray, churning sea, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his greatcoat. She saw him at the fish market, his fine clothes so out of place, looking lost and profoundly alone. He began a quiet campaign, not of courtship, but of service. 2 days after his arrival, a cart pulled up outside her cottage, laden with a cord of seasoned, dry firewood. The man who delivered it simply said it was paid for and left. The next day, after a particularly vicious night of rain, she woke to the sound of hammering. A local carpenter was on her roof, replacing the loose slates that had been tormenting her for months. When she rushed out to demand an explanation, he tipped his cap and said his bill had been settled by the gentleman at the inn. She was furious. It was charity. It was a duke's solution to a commoner's problem. Throw money at it. She marched to the inn, her shawl pulled tight against the wind, ready to give him a piece of her mind. She found him in the common room, nursing a tankard of ale, looking utterly miserable. "Stop it," she said without preamble, standing before his table. He looked up, and the hope that flared in his eyes before he saw her anger was a painful thing to witness. "Stop what?" "The firewood. The roof. Do you think you can buy your way back into my life? Fix my leaky roof and expect me to forget that you broke my heart?" He stood up slowly. "No, I expect nothing. I saw a need, and I had the means to meet it. Is it so wrong to want you and the boy to be warm and dry?" His sincerity was disarming. He was not trying to be clever. He was simply stating a fact. She felt her anger falter, replaced by a weary confusion. "My name is Jenna," she said, clinging to the one piece of her new life that was truly hers. "And his name is Thomas. You do not know him. You have no right." "I would like to," he said, his voice quiet. "Know him, if you would allow it." Before she could answer, the innkeeper's wife bustled over. "Jenna, dear, there you are. Thomas was looking for you. He followed you down. Such a clever lad." Genevieve's blood ran cold. She turned. Thomas was standing in the doorway of the inn, his small face streaked with grime, clutching the charcoal drawing of the ship. He had followed her. He had walked through the village alone. She rushed to him, scooping him into her arms, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and relief. "Thomas, you must never do that again. You must stay where I tell you." He buried his face in her shoulder, frightened by her tone. "I wanted to give the sad man my picture," he mumbled, holding up the crumpled drawing. Genevieve froze. She looked from her son to Alistair, who stood frozen by the table, his face a mask of raw, unguarded emotion. He was looking at Thomas not as an heir or a complication, but as a son, a small boy he had never known. Slowly, as if in a trance, Alistair knelt. He did not get too close. He simply lowered himself to Thomas's level. "The sad man?" he asked, his voice thick. Thomas, feeling braver now that he was in his mother's arms, nodded. He held out the drawing. "It is a ship. To take you home." Alistair reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and took the piece of paper as if it were a holy relic. He stared at the child's clumsy drawing, and Genevieve saw a tear trace a path down his cheek. It was the first time she had ever seen him cry. "Thank you, Thomas," Alistair said, his voice cracking. "It is the finest ship I have ever seen." Something inside Genevieve broke. It was not forgiveness. It was not a surrender. It was a fissure in the wall of ice around her heart. She saw him not as the Duke who had condemned her, but as a father meeting his son for the first time. And she saw her son, with the innocent, heartbreaking compassion of a child, offering comfort to the man who had caused all their pain. "Come, Thomas," she said softly, her anger gone, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it was a physical weight. "Let us go home." She turned to leave, but Alistair spoke again. "A rider arrived for me this morning, from London." She paused, her back to him. "It was my solicitor," he continued. "I have instructed him to begin a full audit of the Blackwood estate accounts for the past 6 years, and to find the man who claimed to be your lover, the one who provided the proof against you. I will find the truth, Genevieve. I will burn their world to the ground for what they did to you, to us." She stood for a long moment, the warmth of her son in her arms, the cold of the past at her back. She did not turn around. She did not give him the absolution he so clearly craved, but she did not tell him to stop either. She simply held her son tighter and walked out of the inn, leaving Alistair on his knees, clutching a child's drawing of a ship. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Alistair kept his distance, but his presence was a constant, gravitational force, pulling the fabric of their lives into a new shape. He sent no more grand gestures of firewood or carpentry. Instead, the acts of service became smaller, more personal. A basket of fresh eggs from a farm up the coast left on her doorstep. A rare, illustrated children's book that appeared on the bench outside her cottage, a silent offering for Thomas. Genevieve accepted them with a conflicted heart. A part of her, the hard, pragmatic survivor, recognized the utility of the gifts, but another, more vulnerable part, saw them for what they were, apologies he did not know how to speak. They were Alistair's new language. He began to speak to Thomas, not as a father asserting his rights, but as a stranger hoping to become a friend. He would be on the beach when Genevieve took Thomas to search for shells. He would not approach them directly, but would be there, skipping stones across the flat, gray water. One day, Thomas, bolder now, ran up to him. "Can you make it skip 7 times?" the boy challenged. Alistair smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes and made Genevieve's breath catch. "I can try." She watched from a distance as Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, crouched in the wet sand and patiently taught their son the art of skipping stones. He showed him how to find the right flat rock, how to hold it, how to flick his wrist. Their heads were bent together, one dark, one with touches of gray at the temples. The resemblance was so stark it was painful. They were father and son, a fact the entire universe seemed to recognize except, perhaps, for Thomas himself. Later that week, a second rider arrived for Alistair, this one carrying a heavy leather satchel. That evening he came to the cottage. He did not knock. He simply stood outside, waiting to be seen. Genevieve had just put Thomas to bed. She saw his silhouette through the window and felt a sense of weary inevitability. She opened the door. He held the satchel in his hands. "The solicitor's initial report has arrived." She let him in. The air was thick with unspoken words. He laid the satchel on the small table and opened it, pulling out a sheaf of papers filled with dense columns of numbers and spidery legal script. "It is worse than I imagined," he said, his voice grim. "Marcus has been systematically embezzling from the estate for at least 8 years. He started small, but after you left, his control became absolute. He has stolen a fortune." He pushed a document toward her. It was a summary of the accounts. Even with her limited knowledge, she could see the discrepancies, the vast sums of money diverted to accounts and companies linked to Marcus Thorne. "He needed you gone," Alistair said, a look of dawning horror on his face. "You were clever. You asked questions about the household expenses. You were starting to notice. He couldn't risk you discovering the full extent of his thievery. So he had to discredit you. He had to remove you completely." He pulled out another set of papers. "And this. My solicitor found the man, the supposed lover. He was a stable hand I had dismissed for drunkenness a month before. Marcus paid him £200 to disappear after he signed a false confession. We have the bank draft. We have his testimony. He is a pathetic creature, terrified of being charged." He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a terrible, righteous fury. "It was all a lie, Genevieve, every last word of it. A cold, calculated plan to ruin you so he could enrich himself. He used my pride and my grief against me. He played me like a fiddle." Genevieve sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. She had known, of course. In her heart, she had always known she was innocent. But to see the proof laid out in black and white, to understand the sheer, venomous scope of the conspiracy against her, was staggering. It was not a crime of passion or a simple misunderstanding. It was a meticulous, cruel campaign of destruction. "He left me with nothing," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He knew I was pregnant." Alistair went pale. "What? How could he have known?" "My lady's maid. I had told her just the week before. She was devoted to me, or so I thought. She must have gone to him." It made a sickening kind of sense. The timing of it all. Marcus had not just wanted her gone. He had wanted her and Alistair's heir gone. With them out of the way, his own position as Alistair's closest relative and advisor would be unassailable. The enormity of the betrayal washed over Alistair. It was not just his wife Marcus had targeted, but his unborn child. The rage in his eyes cooled into something far more dangerous. It was the cold, lethal calm of a man who had found his purpose. "He will not get away with it," Alistair said, his voice a low promise. "I will see him stripped of his title, his lands, his name. I will see him in prison. I will take everything from him, just as he tried to take everything from us." He reached across the table, and for the first time in 5 years, he touched her. His fingers gently covered her hand. His touch was not possessive, not demanding. It was tentative, questioning, an appeal. "Let me fix this," he said. "Let me bring you home. Let me give our son the life he was meant to have." She looked at their joined hands. His was large and calloused from his recent, unaccustomed life. Hers was chapped and work-worn. They were no longer the hands of a duke and duchess. They were the hands of 2 survivors. She did not pull away. "Home?" she said, the word tasting strange on her tongue. "I do not know where that is anymore." "It is wherever you are," he answered, his voice raw with sincerity. "Wherever you and Thomas are, that is home." He was offering her not just a restoration of her title, but a rebuilding of their life on a foundation of truth. It was more than she had ever expected. It was terrifying. And for the first time, a small, reluctant flicker of hope ignited within her. Perhaps the woman she had been was not dead after all. Perhaps she had only been sleeping. The storm that had been brewing within Alistair broke over Blackwood with the force of a hurricane. He returned not as a grieving recluse, but as a wrathful duke. He did not send for Marcus. He went to him. He found his cousin in the library, the very room where he had first been presented with the forged letters, a glass of brandy in his hand and a smug look on his face. The confrontation was not loud, but it was brutal. Alistair laid the solicitor's reports on the table between them, the audits, the confession of the stable hand, the proof of the lady's maid's betrayal. He watched the color drain from Marcus's face, the smugness replaced by a panicked, rat-like desperation. "These are lies, forgeries," Marcus blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Are they?" Alistair's voice was quiet, deadly. "As false as the letters you penned in Genevieve's hand? As false as the life of luxury you have been living at my expense? You did not just rob me of my money, Marcus. You robbed me of my wife. You stole 5 years of my son's life." At the mention of a son, Marcus finally crumbled. The last vestige of his composure shattered. "Son? What son?" "Thomas, my heir. The one you and that treacherous maid tried to erase. Did you think she would simply vanish? That a woman like Genevieve would just lie down and die?" Alistair stepped closer, his shadow falling over his cousin. "You underestimated her, and you underestimated me. You thought I would mourn forever. You were wrong. Now, you will face the consequences." Marcus Thorne's downfall was swift and absolute. He was arrested. The scandal was immense, but Alistair controlled the narrative. The story that emerged was not of a faithless duchess, but of a loyal wife cruelly wronged by a villainous relative. Genevieve was not a fallen woman. She was a victim, a survivor. But while the legal storm raged 90 miles away, a more delicate negotiation was taking place in the small cottage in Saltwind. Genevieve had agreed to return to Blackwood, but on her own terms. She would not be smuggled back in the dead of night. She would not return as a penitent. She would return as the duchess she was, with her son, the rightful heir. The day they were to leave, Thomas fell ill. It began as a simple cough, but quickly deepened into a fever that left him weak and breathless. Genevieve was frantic. The village doctor was old, and his remedies were powerless against the sickness. For 2 days and 2 nights, the boy burned with fever. Alistair refused to leave her side. He sent Silas for the finest physician in the county, a man who arrived after a hard, 12-hour ride. But in the long hours of waiting, it was just Alistair and Genevieve. He became not a duke, but a father, his rank and power useless against the terrifying fragility of his child's life. He bathed Thomas's forehead with cool cloths. He held the boy's small hand, whispering stories of knights and dragons. He sat with Genevieve by the fire, keeping a vigil through the long, dark nights, the silence between them no longer one of anger, but of shared terror. In the darkest hour of the second night, when Thomas's breathing was shallow and ragged, Genevieve finally broke. Sobs racked her body, the fear and exhaustion of 5 years pouring out of her. Alistair did not offer platitudes. He simply moved his chair closer and sat with her, a solid, silent presence in the terrifying dark. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, drawing strength from his steadiness. "I cannot lose him, Alistair," she whispered into the fabric of his coat. "He is all I have." "You will not lose him," he said, his voice a low, fierce vow. "And he is not all you have. You have me, for what it is worth." The fever broke at dawn. The physician, when he finally arrived, confirmed that the worst was over. The relief was so profound it left them both weak. As the sun rose, casting a pale, watery light into the small cottage, Genevieve looked at Alistair. He was disheveled, his face gray with exhaustion, but she had never seen him look more noble. In that crucible of shared fear, the last of her resentment had burned away, leaving something new and fragile in its place. They returned to Blackwood a week later. The staff was lined up to greet them, their faces a mixture of curiosity and awe. Genevieve walked through the grand doors, not as the timid girl who had left, but as a queen returning to her throne. She held Thomas's hand, and Alistair walked beside her, a step behind, a public deference that spoke volumes. He was not reinstating her. He was following her lead. Life at Blackwood was different. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the sound of a child's laughter echoing in the long corridors. Genevieve took an active role in the management of the estate. her sharp mind and practical nature proving invaluable in undoing the years of Marcus's neglect. She and Alistair were partners, in governance as in life. They worked side by side, rebuilding not just the estate's finances, but the foundations of their own relationship. They did not fall back into their old roles. They built new ones. They talked for hours, filling in the 5-year gap with stories of their separate lives. She told him of the kindness of the people of Saltwind, of her fear when she first realized she was with child, of the fierce joy of watching Thomas take his first steps. He told her of the crushing loneliness of the great house, of the slow, creeping suspicion that he had made a terrible mistake, of the hollow victory of his wealth and title. He never asked for her forgiveness directly. Instead, he earned it. He earned it in the way he listened to her opinions. He earned it in the tender, patient way he built a relationship with their son. He earned it in the small, daily acts of love and respect. On Christmas Eve, a year after he had followed the carrier 90 miles, the family was gathered in the drawing room. A fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the festive decorations. The oppressive gloom of the past was gone, replaced by a genuine, peaceful warmth. Thomas, now a confident 5-year-old, was showing Silas a new toy train. Alistair came to sit beside Genevieve on the sofa. He handed her a small, simply wrapped box. "For you," he said, his voice quiet. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside, on a bed of velvet, lay her wedding ring, the one she had left on the mantelpiece 6 years ago. Beside it was a new ring, a simple gold band. "The first is a reminder of the vow I broke," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I hope one day you might wear it again. The second is a new vow, a promise to be the man you always deserved, the man I am trying to become." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. She picked up the new ring and held it out to him. "Will you put it on for me?" He took her hand, the hand that had mended nets and kneaded dough, and he slid the simple gold band onto her finger. It was not a grand ducal ceremony. It was a quiet, profound promise between two people who had been to hell and back and had found their way home. Later, after Thomas was asleep, they stood by the window, looking out at the snow falling softly on the grounds of Blackwood. "I have one more gift for you," Alistair said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another small box. She opened it. Inside was a delicate silver locket. She pressed the clasp and it sprang open. On one side was a miniature portrait of Thomas, his gray eyes bright with laughter. On the other side, it was not a portrait of Alistair, but a tiny, perfect carving of a wren, its head cocked as if listening. He had carved it himself. He had not forgotten. He had understood. The parcels had not been an accusation, but a testament to survival. And this was his answer. He was not trying to erase her past, but to honor it, to build their future upon it. She closed the locket, the cool metal a comforting weight in her palm. "It is beautiful," she whispered. He drew her into his arms, his embrace warm and sure. "Not as beautiful as the woman who sent a ghost to haunt me for 5 years, until I finally had the sense to follow it home." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a pristine, peaceful white. The past was buried, and a new life, clean and bright and full of promise, was just beginning.